So to everyone listening, well, hello. This is a first for the VP Life podcast, as we've got two guests on today. Garrett Salpeter, the owner of NeuFit and the inventor of the Neubie, which we'll be getting into shortly. We're also joined by a return guest and now a Neubie practitioner, Harry Worrow. Try and say that 3 times fast. Who's going to be my wingman going into today's episode. Before we dig into everything NeuFit though, and Neubie, I reckon intros are a great place to start. Garrett, we have time aplenty, so would you mind running us through your backstory and how you went from being, I think, an electrical engineer, if I'm not much mistaken, and well, then into this whole field of neuroscience, and then into the inventor of what is arguably, not to bust you up completely, one of the greatest tools in physical and neurological rehabilitation currently on the market.
Well, thank you for that. So I feel very fortunate to have found a way to sort of combine all of my interests and passion and academic background. As you mentioned, I do have some academic background in engineering, a master's degree in engineering. I also was a physics major in college. I did additional graduate school in neuroscience as I got more and more interested in this field. And there was a really interesting catalyst for me, which was an experience I had. I also was an athlete. I got really passionate, like Harry, about fitness and athletic performance. And for me, it was really as a vehicle to try to be the best athlete I could be. So, for me, my sport was ice hockey. And I had injuries along the way as well. And I had a lot of experiences with traditional physical therapy, traditional orthopedic medicine. And it was very disappointing, disenfranchising, dare I even say dehumanizing. I mean, it was really, it just, they were telling me to rely on this brace, this anti-inflammatory, just sort of masking the symptoms or working around, not really getting at anything close to what I perceive to be the root cause of why the injury happened in the first place or why it was taking so long to recover, any of that sort of thing. And I didn't have the words for it at the time, but I just felt that, at one point I thought about going pre-med, and based on those experiences, I just knew that wasn't for me. And then I had this experience where I was playing hockey, had a torn ligament. I was told I was going to need to have surgery. And I met a doctor who was doing functional neurology. And this was my first real exposure to the importance of the nervous system, the role of the nervous system in healing, and also my first exposure to direct current. So it was like an older analog device with a bunch of dials at the time, more like a microcurrent type of thing. But I went through treatments focused on the neurological response to injury and using older versions of direct current. And that literally helped me heal my ligaments, avoid surgery. And I was relieved. I was excited as a hockey player to be back out there sooner. But as a pre-engineering student, as someone who was really looking at this scientifically from first principles, I was just it's like this mind-blowing eureka moment. And going through that, I really felt a calling within me to share this work. It just resonated with me at such a deep level that I felt this calling to share that work with as many people as I could. And that really sent me on this journey, which led me to initially open a clinic and get the 10,000 hours of work over 7 or 8 years using older versions of electrical stimulation technology, do the additional work in neuroscience, academically, education-wise. And then I finally got to the point where, about 7 or 8 years into that journey, where I was sort of waiting for someone else to come out with something that would, I could use to maybe open more clinics and just, keep doing this type of work. I finally got to the point where I was like, you know what? I just feel like I have to do it myself. So I did not set out initially to, start a medical device business or develop a product, but it just felt like, sort of the necessary next right step along the way. And now that's been another 7 or 8 years that we've had the product out now. And it's been, really wonderful to see it grow in the US and then now in the UK and other regions of the world.
Yeah, no, it's definitely picking up steam. I think I initially First heard about you on Ben Greenfield's podcast, yeah, like years back, and I've just been, yeah, my medical history side, that's a story for another day. I've been sort of itching to get on one for years, and then but anyway, yeah, your background as a engineer I find fascinating. I'm sure you're familiar with Dr. Thomas Seeger, the guy who invented, well, he's I suppose the guy who invented the ice bath, or at least initially commercialized it. He owns a company called Morozko Forge. He's an engineer too, and it's just fascinating to see how many engineers are sort of finding their way, whether they have a sort of a formal background in biology or not, into this field. It's like you said, it's this first principles way of thinking, which I just think really lends engineers to being able to successfully support what is happening in this world of functional medicine, just very broadly speaking. The physics is amazing too. I must admit, I'm way too dumb to study physics. I did biochem and neurophysiology, and that was it. That was enough for me. But anyway, right.
That counts. Don't worry. That definitely counts.
All right, sweet. Okay, right. Before we dive into it, I reckon we might as well get an intro for Harry too. Harry's a biomechanics specialist. For those in the audience who maybe are not familiar with him, we did an episode a few months back, which we'll link to in the show notes. It was a great intro to Harry's world and how one can look into physical rehabilitation from maybe and more of an alternative viewpoint, just sort of bypassing the standard physio sort of approach that we're all indoctrinated into believing is the one-stop shop. But yeah, Harry, a quick intro from you would be amazing, mate. Just who you are, what you do, all that good stuff.
Yeah, happy to. So unlike you two really, really clever people, I don't believe I'm as as intelligent, but I do believe myself as an engineer, but more of from a body point of view. So, we're looking at, moving the body.
Squishy type.
What's that?
A squishy type, squishy engineer.
Yeah, exactly. So, looking at the human body as a structure and trying to optimize how to build it up again, if there is, a dysfunction or an injury, and looking more at the body as one and treating it as a unit rather than, in isolation. So what I do, I look at the body as a structure and see where there may be a dysfunction and how that is affecting how the body moves through, the gait cycle, which is essentially just, walking, and yeah, I'm definitely bringing more from outside the box ideas in terms of movements and how maybe sometimes a lot of people come to me and they find that the standard approach of treatment is not working as well as they would like to, and then they come to me and they find that I'm looking at the body from more of a systemic point of view, so not just the muscular system, but how the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system is actually involved in lots of the processes of movement and how that can affect posture, and of course if posture affects function can then affect performance. So I look at the body from a whole view rather than just one
holistic
area. But yeah, at the same time I'm extremely passionate about helping people, and there's not one fits all in a way, one size fits all. It's very much dealing with person at a time, because we know, as you know, Garrett, you're dealing with a human and they come with emotions, they come with different kind of traumatic experiences. Maybe the injury wasn't just football or ice hockey, it might have been just falling over in the house, so there's a lot of things that we need to take into account when looking at injuries, but very excited to, of course, come at my approach of more of a software approach now, which of course we're going to speak about today, which is exciting. But dealing with the software now as well as the hardware approach is going to probably give my future clients and clients right now some really, really great progress and great results.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thanks for that, gentlemen. Before we get into the newbie, I think it would be great if we could lay a basic foundation of knowledge, as I know this conversation might get a little technical. Hopefully we can keep it as high level as possible, but I reckon you're the guy to ask here, Garrett. So would you mind giving us a quick sort of, I suppose, 101 in sort of nervous system physiology, how the nervous system operates and functions, and then we can take it from there.
I think that's a great place to start. And also, circling back, you both have mentioned, engineering. Harry, I like you describing yourself as an engineer of the body. I think engineering really is problem solving. It started with how do we get water from up here to down there, right? Build an aqueduct, build this pathway. How do we solve problems given certain constraints? And so you have to understand what the constraints are, what the system is, or the context is in which you're working. And the nervous system is a big part of the context of a human being. Like Harry said, human beings have emotions and they respond to different stimuli in different ways. And that response to stimulus happens within the nervous system. And I think the first point as we jump off into this topic to understand is that when we're talking about pain and injury, like I talked about how I had a torn ligament. People listening to this may have experiences with sprained ankles or herniated discs or rotator cuff injuries, like these issues that are structural, that are quote unquote hardware of the body. And I think one of the big breakthroughs, and the reason we're talking about the nervous system, just to really establish the high level, the reason we're talking about the nervous system is that so much of the reason why it takes a long time to recover, or why people get locked in a cycle of chronic pain even after the injury has healed, or why we can't do the things that we wish to do, oftentimes the issue is in the software, in the nervous system, in the underlying system that's sending the signals to the muscles that influences the overall healing process and the ability of the body to deliver nutrients to an injured area to help it heal. So there's that sort of that relationship and that context, I think, is worth understanding. And then, overall, when we talk about the nervous system, it's probably worth defining what we mean by that. So, I think collectively we can talk about the brain and the spinal cord, which would be classically considered the central nervous system, and then the nerves that leave the spinal cord and go out to the visceral organs, to the arms, to the legs, that would be called the peripheral nervous system. But all of that, and it's an electrical signal, really an electrochemical system that monitors everything going on in the internal and external environment, and then creates actions and responses based on that. So it really is the control system of the body. And I like that hardware and software distinction where, I think everyone knows the hardware, right? Our bones, muscles, tendons, ligaments, the connective tissues, then our organs, right? The liver, stomach, intestines, heart, lungs. Those are all the hardware. And then the software is what controls it. Just the same as if you have your computer, your computer has a screen, it has a processor, it has memory, and then the software is what actually sends the electrons in there and calls from memory certain things into the processor and creates images on the screen and all that. So the software, the operating system of the computer is what makes it run. You could have the hardware sitting there, but without an operating system, it's just going to be, a piece of metal sitting there. Well, just like us, if we don't have our operating system, our nervous system, we're just going to be a piece of flesh, a puddle of flesh on the floor sitting there. So it's really the operating system there, and it's so relevant for how we heal, how we recover, how we move. It controls our organs, so it's relevant for our heart rate and respiration, which Harry was talking about already. Relevant to how we digest food and eliminate waste. It controls reproductive function, the release of hormones, our stress response. I think everyone listening to this likely knows how chronic disease, so much of the issues, the health issues that we have as a society are really influenced by excessive amounts of stress, chronic stress, and a poor ability to handle stress. So it's all neurological, really.
Yeah, it is indeed. And I just love the fact that you brought up stress. I mean, it's not a sexy subject to talk about, but ultimately it is, I mean, beyond the basic what you shovel down your throat, it is arguably one of the biggest sort of driving factors of what is driving sort of chronic disease. I mean, I've sort of been in this functional medicine space for a number of years now, and you work with practitioners and everyone sort of got their fundamentally has their approach. Some will go gut first, have a very gut-centric approach, as I'm sure you know. Others will start to sort of do a lot of testing and look at hormones first, etc. But ultimately it all comes back down to the bioenergetics of the cell, and that is fundamentally governed by the nervous system at the end of the day. Garrett, thank you. That was a great answer. Before we carry on, would you mind also just sort of breaking down the differences between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system, those being the two major branches, of course? Again, I just think for the listeners, having a fairly sort of decent grasp of that will allow them to sort of understand some of the terminology and concepts that we'll be talking about in a minute.
Absolutely. And, you mentioned the Morosco Forge cold plunge, and that's a good context to look at this, because when someone is using that and steps into that cold water, it's around 32 Fahrenheit or around 0 Celsius. It's literally right around freezing. There's going to be some ice floating in that. It's really cold. And in response to that, the second that our skin sensors, the nervous system receptors, perceive that cold, they think, holy shit, we might freeze to death. Pardon my language. But there is a stress response, and that's the sympathetic nervous system. It doesn't have anything to do with sympathy. That's the sympathetic, sometimes called fight or flight. And so that is this alarm response, that oh shit moment, something's happening. We need to mount some sort of response. So there's a stressor, in this case, cold temperature, and then there's a stress response, which is what happens inside the body. And in that case, there's the release of hormones like adrenaline or epinephrine, same hormone, different names. And then changes in, for example, what the nervous system controls in the vasculature, the blood vessels, right? It constricts and dilates, it controls that. So it's going to constrict the blood vessels in the limbs. It's going to cause us to send blood away from the arms and the legs in towards the core of the body, trying to preserve heat and warmth in the visceral organs as a survival mechanism. So that is part of the sympathetic nervous system stress response in that example. There's other times where, sometimes it's just, gosh, I look at my calendar today and I've got meeting after meeting and I have emails to respond to, and that creates a stress response, even though I don't physically need the same sort of adrenaline as if and movement capacity as if I was going to run for my life or face a physical life or death challenge. Our biology, our bodies, our operating systems don't really know the difference, because they use the same mechanism for oh my gosh, I have a work deadline and 26 unread emails that I need to get to today. The same mechanism for that as they do for, oh my gosh, I need to run for my life because there's a bear chasing me. So all of that is the sympathetic response. And then ideally, whenever we meet a stress or challenge, we come back down, the adrenaline flows back to baseline over a reasonable time course, not staying elevated for too long. And then we go into a more parasympathetic dominant state, which is sometimes called rest and digest, because it has to do with, of course, being in a more restful state, digesting food so we can rebuild, sometimes called feed and breed. Feeding, of course, is eating and digesting, absorbing nutrients. Again, breeding is because that's where we can invest energy in longer term growth and repair processes and reproductive system, right? So feed and breed. And then also sleep, is kind of the ultimate parasympathetic state there. So there's, those are the two branches, and balancing that is really vitally important for health, for longevity, for sleep, for performance, for reducing the risk of chronic disease, all those things. It's really vital.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I learned something there. Harry, you got any questions there, mate?
No, I mean, of course, Garrett, wonderful description of the two nervous systems. But I think it's interesting to use the master reset that, of course, helps people go more into the parasympathetic nervous system state. And when I'm dealing with clients that are coming in with chronic pain or acute pain, you're finding those people that are, they're in a stressed state and they can't get out of it because of the pain levels. And it's wonderful to have, there's many approaches you can take to getting somebody into a parasympathetic nervous system state, but one being the Neubie of the master reset, of being able to use that to help stimulate that, to then allow the next step to be going into some drills, some correctives, some exercises, but they might not have responded as well to those exercises if they just came straight in and you just placed that kind of stressor on them. So you know, the parasympathetic nervous system state is just something that I think more people need to realize that they need to move in, rather than how we traditionally look at exercise is very, we need to work 100% every single day. We need to, you know, push our bodies to the max. But realistically, from a longevity point of view, us humans are a species of longevity. So we need to realize that parasympathetic nervous system state we must be in that. Even when we start to move our bodies, we need to make sure that we are in control and we can breathe. And yeah, I'm probably babbling on a little bit, but 100%.
No, it's all good.
In terms of that, you mentioned, Harry, the master reset there. Just for context, if you're listening to this and think, oh, what is that? So that's a technique or a protocol that we have at NeuFit that is essentially our version of a parasympathetic nervous system stimulation technique, or a vagus nerve. If you may have heard of the vagus, not like Las Vegas, but VAGUS. The vagus nerve is the primary nerve pathway by which the parasympathetic nervous system acts on the body, and it influences, it signals from and to a lot of the visceral organs. It's relevant in heart rate variability, which we could dive into more if we want to.
Yeah, we'd love to.
And so that's our technique for doing that. And it's essentially, like Harry said, if we're trying to go all the time and we're stuck in that sympathetic dominant state, being able to have a tool that can help us get, and there are many tools, things like techniques like meditation, like, deep breathing, like there's all the different things that can, going for a walk in nature can help us shift more towards the parasympathetic. And this is one that just significantly, repeatedly, consistently gets people into that more parasympathetic state too. So it's another tool, a powerful tool there to have in that toolbox.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think where it really beats meditation is that it sort of, well, it bypasses that, how do I say it? It bypasses that, not the impedance. Yeah, I suppose that's potentially a word, of the individual. You are directly regulating the nervous system, opposed to trying to get the individual in question, perhaps, to try and regulate their own nervous system, which, when you throw emotion into the picture, obviously can get pretty difficult. Anyway, Garrett, I think it would be a pretty decent time to introduce what the Neubie is. I know we sort of glanced over it a few times now, but can you introduce what this contraption that you've designed fundamentally is, and then how it operates, and we can then take it from there.
The Neubie is an acronym for neurobioelectric, and it's the product for which we're best known. And it's interesting. People see wires and electrodes on the skin, and they think, oh, it's another TENS unit or something like that. But it's a different type of current. So it is using electricity, but it's using direct current instead of alternating current. And there's some really interesting history there. There's several benefits of direct current, which we can talk about. And those benefits have been known for decades, but there was always this problem where you couldn't get high enough, therapeutic levels of direct current into the body without stinging and burning the skin. And so the Soviets did some of this, back in the 1960s, when they were trying to assert dominance and in sport. They were trying to show that their communist system was superior because they were able to produce the best athletes and win Olympic gold medals. And we have a lot of, so many things like periodization and plyometrics. So many of the things that we talk about in sports science today came out of that Soviet era. So there's, really, really good stuff there. So they did some of this preliminary work, and they would literally, have burn marks on their athletes when they were doing some of these experiments with direct current. Of course, that didn't work here in the West. Yeah. So direct current essentially fell out of favor for decades. And in its place, filling that void or that vacuum came all of the alternating current modalities, like the TENS units, what we call quote unquote Russian stim, even though the Russians used both. But traditional NMES, FES, interferential, these types of electric stimulation treatments that people may be familiar with. So all these came to be, because the alternating current, as that signal goes back and forth, it eliminates charge buildup. Because with direct current, you had these benefits, but you had a problem where eventually all the negative ions would accumulate around the positive electrode and vice versa. And when those charges accumulate, they create resistance, which blocks the flow of current and causes it to be dissipated as heat, leading to the burning. So some of the underlying physiology there. So we found a way. I'll get to the benefits and why that matters momentarily, but we essentially found a way, an engineering breakthrough, to be able to get direct current into the body while reducing that charge buildup, so that we don't have the stinging and burning. So we get the benefits of direct current, which again I promise I'll get to, with the benefits of direct current with the comfort of alternating current. Okay, so why does that matter? Well, with direct current, there's a few differences in how it how the body responds and how it influences the body when it's applied here. So first, to understand, direct current is basically creating an electric field going in one direction. So people listening, you can't see. If you're watching, you can see I'm basically holding my hands in an angle, making a ramp. So if I had a ball at the top of a hill, it's going to roll down the hill under the influence of gravity. And so how steep that hill is essentially how strong an electric field is, where if there's a positive charge at the top of that hill, it's going to roll down towards the negative direction of the electric field. The more voltage there is, the steeper it is and the faster it's going to roll. And then how fast it rolls is essentially the amount of current. So a little bit of electricity 101 there. So
is it building up an electrical gradient then? Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, that's what it is. That is, we even use the same terminology. The gradient of an electric field is the same as a gradient, like it's a similar word or same word as a gradient of a hill, how steep the hill is. So the difference then between direct current and alternating current is that with direct current, that gradient, that slope, that hill is always pointing in the same direction, whereas with alternating current, it oscillates back and forth, positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative. And so what happens there is a couple things. One is, as if you apply that to the body where there's a high enough power level, great enough amount of power, it will cause muscles to co-contract and fight against each other, because you're signaling this positive, negative, positive, negative. So you get agonist, antagonist co-contraction. So it's like bicep and tricep fighting against each other, hamstring and quad fighting against each other. And so it's sort of like if you were driving a car and you were hitting the throttle and the brake pedal at the same time, you'd be wasting a lot of energy because you'd be resisting your own movement, creating a lot of undue wear and tear, unnecessary wear and tear on the various parts of the body of the car, on the engine, on the axles, on the brakes, whatever it might be. And, that eventually can lead to some, breakdown and damage. And if you use direct current, you get that signal flowing in one direction only. You bypass virtually all of that co-contraction, that internal resistance. You can get a lot more efficient signaling. You can also get a lot more sensory and afferent input into the nervous system, because you're bypassing a lot of that, especially that protective co-contraction. You get a lot more sensory input into the nervous system. Remember, we talked about how the nervous system senses everything about the environment and also creates responses. So the more you can target and create specific sensory inputs where they're needed, the more you can influence the nervous system to work the processing in the brain and output into the other side of the nervous system. The more you can influence those. So it allows us to think more of the nervous system as an operating system, like software, and get more precise and specific in terms of programming that for more efficient mobility, stability, movement, speed, power, or just being able to move with less pain, all these things. So the precision there in terms of nervous system, I'll say programming. And then there's also another category of benefit where the direct current allows us to apply these electric fields that can influence the body's own internal healing processes. So there is a little bit of an overlap with the hardware. So I don't know if you've read or heard of a book called The Body Electric by Robert Becker. So really fascinating book. I highly recommend the book. It's one of my favorites. I've read it several times, and each time I do, I get just really inspired. So it's a book from, I believe, the late 1980s. Robert Becker was an orthopedic surgeon, and he did some of the research and then also wrote and popularized research that others had done. But one of the things that he really wrote a lot about was the salamander, because a salamander is the most complex animal that can regenerate entire limbs and significant segments of its body. And so if you look at, we can dive more into this if we want to, but the high level, the takeaway message of this is that the reason the salamander is able to do that is because of the electric fields that its own body creates that inform, that influence, that guide the healing and regenerative processes. And there's a distinct difference. Actually, immediately after an injury, we as humans have the same electrical fields created in our own bodies naturally that guide the healing process, same as a salamander for the first 7 days. But then ours just goes back to zero and we get scar tissue, whereas the salamander's electric field flips, causes the regenerative processes to happen. And that's the big underlying difference in the salamander's biology and why they can regenerate. So I'm not saying we're using direct current, at least not yet, to regenerate limbs, but we are seeing that by applying these direct current fields to the body, we're able to tap into some of that ability to influence and accelerate and improve the body's own healing processes. So there's these two main categories of benefits. One is that signaling into the nervous system, and then the other is the ability to use direct current, use the electric fields to help facilitate or assist or support the body's healing processes.
That's amazing. So many questions. Before I dive in, Harry, you got anything?
Garrett, what do you or have you experienced using different types of sensory input? So Neubie being one of them, but have you found that you've used different inputs visually, hearing, audio, or taste or smell? Have you used any of those types of inputs with clients, and has that helped?
So there's a few ways to conceptualize this. I mean, a lot of people may have the experience of or may hear that and think like, gosh, what are you talking about? This is over my head. But it's actually very simple. Like think about listening to music to get pumped up. Like that's an audio input
Exactly.
that causes you to have a physiological response, right? So this is very real. I think a lot easier to understand than one might initially think.
Mm-hmm.
And there's cool things you can do. Like I've done, experimentally, had people smell. So you can see patterns. A couple of cool just examples. Maybe a slight tangent, but you can see patterns in people sometimes where if you're trying to help someone with, they come to see you because they have chronic pain. And the pain is all right-sided. It's like right elbow, right low back, right hip, right knee. It's like, what's going on there? Well, one of the things that our brains do is, the brain creates a signal of pain as a response to perceived threat, and it also will inhibit pain, and that works in a part of the brain called the PMRF, getting down closer to the brainstem, pons for pontomedullary reticular formation, PMRF, pons and medulla. So for the neuroscience nerds out there like me that care about that, but not important to remember that. So the brain will essentially inhibit pain ipsilaterally, meaning on the same side as that. And so if one side, if that particular brain structure is weaker on one side, and you can infer that or you hypothesize that might be the case because there's more pain on that one side. You can think, okay, this person has all right-sided pain. Perhaps it's that PMRF. Perhaps it's a deficit in that lower part of the right side of their brain. And so maybe you could think you want to stimulate the left cortex, which is going to go across to the lower right part of that brain, or you can do something that's going to stimulate directly that lower part of the right brain. And so you can start to think about, like, I'd want to provide Neubie stimulation on a certain side of the body. You actually So for this, you'd want to stimulate on the left side to bring it. So let me just go back and correct something that I said a moment ago. So for this, we actually would not want to stimulate the opposite cortex. We want to stimulate the ipsilateral cortex. So we may actually want to stimulate more in a case like this, more of the left side of the body to get that sensory input to the right sensory cortex, which is going to stimulate the right side of the brain. So it's a little bit counterintuitive, because if that particular imbalance is an issue, and I'll bring this back to answer your question, I promise. Because if that's an issue, then a lot of times you'll work on the right side because that's where the person has pain, but then you actually reinforce an imbalance where there's more activity in the left side of the brain. So doing things like sensory input in the left ear to get into the right brain, or covering for just a moment, you don't want to do it for too long, covering the right eye to get more visual input into the left brain. You can do stuff like that. Smell is the only sense that goes to the same side of the brain instead of crosses to the opposite. So in this case, you'd smell something in the right nostril. So there's different examples like that, where you can provide input. And this is sort of the functional neurology approach, where you'd want to provide certain inputs to preferentially bring up or down, either a side of the brain or a certain part of the brain. And there's people who are real experts in this who can map out the pathways. And it's been a while since I've really studied in depth the functional neuroanatomy, but you can use very precise stimulus and inputs to precisely dial up or down certain parts of the brain and create really amazing results for people. And where stuff like that often comes in is, post-concussion symptoms, or, brain injury, or, stuff like that, where you really want to get precise, but it's relevant for performance for elite athletes also. It's just really amazing stuff.
Is so interesting. That's why I love doing what I do, because it's not just do exercise and get this result. There's so many ways you can get somebody to do something, and it's just fascinating how you can use those different types of inputs to get a result. And it's certainly something I'm looking more and more into using with my clients to speed up the progress.
Definitely. Thanks for that, Harry. Garrett, I'd love to just sort of jump back quickly and just talk about more it's from a healing standpoint. You touched on this idea that it's sort of we going back to the salamander analogy quickly, if you don't mind. Do you think there's anything to be said about sort of, broadly speaking, a DC therapy maybe supporting stem cell proliferation or stem cell output in that regard, or is that a bit of a stretch, do you think?
I'm really excited about this. I'm not prepared to make any claims that that we're doing that right now. We do have some research, actually. I'll touch on real quickly. At the beginning of this year, we actually released and published in the Journal of Diabetes Research the first study of its type comparing in humans head-to-head alternating current versus direct current. So this particular study was on diabetic neuropathy patients in their 70s, when it's been written off that they could ever actually heal in any meaningful way. And it's more about just managing symptoms, reducing pain. And so half the group, it's 150 patients, 75 of them got alternating current TENS units. And they did see some reductions in pain, which is good, but that was it. The other half, the other 75 who got the direct current of the Neubie, not only did they see reductions in pain, but they saw improvements in sensation, increased functional abilities, and we saw increases in EMG, actual increases in the amount of nerve electricity being conducted. So we're actually seeing some nerve regeneration there. So there is some regenerative ability in humans, whether that's guided by stem cell proliferation or not. We have to do the mechanistic studies to find out. But I do think that in the next, I would have said 20 years, but now with the rate at which AI is accelerating medical understanding and breakthroughs, maybe it's in the next 5 or 10, I think we'll be able to use, electric fields, technologies like this to guide salamander-like regenerative abilities in humans. I'm very bullish on that idea. I've been fascinated by that for 15 years since I read The Body Electric, and every time I reread it, I just feel like we're getting closer and closer and closer. It's, science fiction is going to become science fact. And um, I do so tying back to your question, Rob, there is a connection between stem cells and these electric fields. And in salamanders, which is written about by Dr. Becker in that book, The Body Electric, he outlines the process, the mechanism of how it actually works, that these electric fields in salamanders guide their amazing regenerative abilities. And it's fascinating. What the electric fields do is they actually cause cells to de-differentiate back into stem cells. So if you have a stem cell, it's like a blank canvas. It could become a liver cell, a kidney cell, a muscle cell, a bone cell, a brain cell, right? A stem cell could become any of those. But what the electric fields do is they actually cause, and in this case, I believe it was mostly red blood cells. It would cause cells to de-differentiate after they've differentiated into another cell type, to go back to being stem cells, so that they could then be a part of this regenerative process, becoming whatever tissue they need to be to build that new limb or that new part of the tail or whatever, the body segment. And then the electric field guided that stem cell into position and signaled it to become whatever it needed to be. So there is a strong connection, Rob, to your point. It's a great point. There's a strong connection between electric fields and the ability to perhaps even create, but at least influence, direct, and inform what a stem cell would become.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think this whole sort of field of what's, I suppose, this emerging field of electric medicine is just fascinating. I'll be honest, it's completely beyond me. I'm still trying to figure out how to sort of properly interpret an Oates test for the most part. So, but yeah, no, it's just, it's incredible. It just speaks really to the sort of the innate sort of regenerative capacity of the human body and this ability to find homeostasis when the conditions are right, ultimately. I mean, this could go into a broader discussion potentially about things like EMF and Wi-Fi. Actually, what the heck? Let's ask the loaded question. What do you think about these non-native EMF fields like 5G, EMF, Wi-Fi, things that are going to sort of interfere with calcium gated voltage channels, sort of upset calcium regulation within cells, etc. Do you, I mean, obviously, with your background in, I suppose, what is essentially electrophysiology, do you think that these fields are a cause to concern, very broadly speaking, or is it a bit overblown?
There's part of me that's on each side of this fence here. There's so we were talking about Robert Becker. So he actually, at the end of the book, The Body Electric, he talks about the perils of electro pollution, and he writes a whole second book on the topic. And he's very concerned, for the reasons that you described and alluded to, because of how the electric fields, the innate electric fields that can be very subtle in our bodies, control so many internal processes, and how they can be hijacked and interfered with by non-native, external artificial EMFs. So there's definitely, it's definitely real. It's worth talking about. So the people who say, oh, they don't do anything because of the frequency or the power levels or stuff like that, that's that's just not true. There is clear mechanisms by which they can interact with the body. But then at the same time, there's another part of me that looks at it like, okay, there's this ambient stressor that is going to be here, so I want to make myself as resilient as possible. But at the same time, I would not want to live right underneath a cell phone tower. And I just last week was out in off the grid for a few days doing a camping and kayaking trip.
I saw that. I'm very jealous.
I don't know if it was just because of the absence of EMFs or just, there's more time in nature there with friends, change of pace. But, I don't know. So I don't know what degree of that was being away from EMFs, but I definitely felt better and had good heart rate variability, in my Whoop and all that stuff too. So, I don't know. It's definitely an area for concern. I haven't dove in lately into the literature on that, but I am curious. So I may do a little bit of research as soon as we hang up this call. Actually, start looking, seeing what I can pull up.
Fair enough. Yeah, no, I think where there's smoke, there's fire. And I do fundamentally agree with you. I think it's interesting to note that people who are already sort of compromised in terms of their health are more likely to be sort of electrically sensitive than those who maybe are in a good state of health to begin with. And I think that speaks potentially to the way that their sodium potassium pump is operating. You know what? This is going to get very deep very quickly. Let's bypass that. Garrett, I'd love to sort of segue into talking about the NeuFit method a little more. I know we've already touched on it, courtesy of Harry's question earlier. And this obviously takes this sort of whole method sort of takes into account that maybe the listener has access to a Neubie to begin with. But I think it's important to sort of help people to understand how the process works. I know I know Harry. Again, Harry's obviously been through this with me. He's given me a few sponge baths now, and but yeah, would you mind sort of running us through what the Neubie method is, just fundamentally, and some of the basic protocols there, just sort of an elaboration of what you touched on earlier with Harry.
Absolutely. So the NeuFit method is our overall approach for being able to find where the nervous system is going to be delaying or impeding the healing process or limiting performance. And one interesting tidbit on that is that it often is doing that for a reason. You know, we don't just wake up one day and our brains say, oh, I want to spend extra energy, you know, keeping that part of my body tight, you know, just burning extra calories for no reason, right? It's doing it for a reason. It's doing it to protect us. And so sometimes it can feel like the nervous system is working against us, but really it has noble intentions. So I think it's important to have that perspective going into it. And what we're trying to do then is figure out how we can get the nervous system really to work with us rather than against us, so to speak. And when we're talking about pain and injury, you know, people are most commonly first interacting with NeuFit in the context of either they had a recent injury or surgery they're trying to recover from, or they've had chronic pain, something that's been around for a while, you know, chronic back pain, chronic knee pain they're trying to work on. And so one of the biggest things that we want to do, first of all, is figure out, okay, what if it's chronic pain, what isn't working properly that's allowing them to have this vulnerability in the injured joint in the first place, or what's going on with the autonomic nervous system that's keeping them locked in that cycle of perceived threat and pain, right? There can be, you know, that gets back into stress and things that we talked about, you know, many minutes ago. So there's parts there. So one of the things that we really like to do first is this mapping process where we'll take an electrode and scan around on the body. And the cool thing about that is that we're actually, because of these effects of direct current that we talked about earlier, we're actually introducing load onto those tissues. So if if you're just listening, you don't see this, but if you're watching, you see like I'm dragging a pad over my bicep and then the front deltoid and then my pec minor, pec major. So when I stimulate those areas, I'm actually sending the same signals as if there's load or challenge happening there. And what we're trying to do, remember we talked about the nervous system, there's the sensing of the environment, and there's the reaction to it. So what we're trying to do is basically see where things are working well and where there's some sort of deficit or limitation. Because if we challenge an area that's working well, it can contract and work through its full range of motion and stretch and relax and knows how to do all those things. If we stimulate that area, you know, that person's brain and nervous system is going to see that signal and say, oh, that's no big deal. You know, if we're doing this to Harry, you know, Harry's brain is going to say, oh yeah, there's no big deal. That's within our current capacity, no cause for alarm. But if we then stimulate an area where he hasn't been moving that recently, he's been avoiding it, and it's something new, right? That novel stimulation is threatening to the nervous system. That his brain is going to say, whoa, that's new, that's different, sound the alarm. Or if we stimulate an area where he's actively guarding or inhibiting that because of a recent injury or bad habits developed over time, we stimulate one of those, his brain is going to say, whoa, whoa, alarm, alarm, where they're attacking us in a vulnerable place where we're trying to protect. And so we're basically trying to find those areas. And then once we find them, we stimulate them as the individual, or as Harry or whoever it is, goes through movement patterns where they're compensating, because we want to basically teach them to start reincorporating those areas where there's deficits, reincorporating those back into the various movement patterns to improve function. And it is interesting. Like I talked about how the nervous system is doing this for a reason. Like after an injury, the nervous system goes into this protect mode where it's trying to limit movement there, thinking like, oh my gosh, we could get attacked again, or we could get hurt again at any moment. And that ends up being productive if there is a threat. But if we're trying to heal, and it can actually stand in the way, because like tension, for example, could reduce blood flow and impair the body's ability to send nutrients and raw materials there. So what we're trying to do is, in that is sort of restore natural baseline
homeostasis,
movement and signaling. Yeah, homeostasis from a nervous system function perspective for sure. And then that's working locally on these areas. Then we also like to do things globally. Like we've already talked about the master reset, which is sort of a global parasympathetic rest and digest nervous system activation technique. That's super valuable. And then we also like to do things like the electric glove, where we can do manual therapy. A lot of the physiotherapists out there and other clinicians like to do manual therapy, where you're introducing pressure onto certain areas of the body. And people used to talk about how, oh, I'm breaking up scar tissue with my hands or stuff like that. And we now know that's just not happening. I mean, unless you have like an ice pick and like you're something, you're not breaking up scar tissue. What you're doing is creating neurological input to help the body facilitate the change in tone, or the relaxation release of tissues in that area, and increasing blood flow and different things like that. So it really ultimately is interaction with the nervous system. And so we can do that. We can actually hook the direct current signal up to a glove, or just run it through your hands, but send it literally through the tips of one's fingers, and you can help accelerate those neurological effects of manual therapy with that too. So there's a lot of different ways to use it. And then as we get once we get through the initial stages of working through pain, injury, and dysfunction, then we can use it for muscle hypertrophy, for example, to build muscle, or to work on precise movement patterns. You can work on contracting different frequencies that contract one side of the joint, as you use another frequency on the other side of the joint to lengthen, so you can create more range of motion and motor control, and strength and muscle building. You can use it like digital weight to to amplify. If you think about just one final point here. So we've gotten from pain and injury and early stages of recovery now to like exercise, fitness, or performance, or for athletes, return to play. If we're talking about strength, what is strength? Well, I would say it's a neurological skill, and that's really informed by you listening to this may have heard of Pavel Tsatsouline, the Russian guy who came over to America and had a lot of this Russian-based education on the importance of the nervous system for creating strength. So he was one of the first to introduce me to this idea, and really, really fascinating. But the idea that strength really is a neurological skill, and that leads to techniques that he teaches, like greasing the groove, and really these wonderful things that are just really, really good. But the take-home message is that strength is the ability to contract more motor units at any one given moment in time. And so you can actually use, that's the reason we lift weight. If I'm just curling my arm with no weight at all, it might take 20% of my muscle fibers and motor units. But when I add weight, that feedback forces me to contract maybe 30%, 40%, 50%. You can also then put the pads of the Neubie on there at certain frequencies to get that same 30 or 40 or 50% recruitment, but without having to touch a weight. So it can make it safer, less risk of injury or re-injury. You can kind of use it like digital weight for strength or building muscle too. So there's all these different ways to
utilize it,
to use it.
Yeah, and that's incredible. I'm going to sort of break my oath and ask one sort of technical question. That being, what mechanistically is happening when the Neubie finds a hotspot specifically? I mean, like I said during my initial session with Harry, we went over my QLs. For the audience, those are muscles in your lower back. My left one lit up like a Christmas tree, and it was a proper hotspot, and then the right one was fine. But fundamentally, can you sort of elucidate as to what is sort of physiologically or biochemically happening to create that response when that DC current is thrown into the equation?
So there's some things that we know and some things that we have yet to learn. I do intend to learn more about what's actually happening, at a cellular biochemical level, things like that. What we do know neurologically is that pain is a signal created by the brain in a response to perceived threat. It's the brain's way of saying, "Hey, don't load that area, don't do that." It's a signal to change your behavior, to do or stop doing something. So it's a signal actively created by the brain. And in this case, when when Harry was mapping you, Rob, your lower back, he went over a side that was working well, and your brain saw that and said, again, no cause for alarm. But when he stimulated the other side where there was an issue, he was stimulating that, and for some reason, that load, that signal, that challenge on that tissue was going into a vulnerable area to where your brain saw that and said, whoa, alarm, this is threatening. And so in response to that perceived threat, it created that output signal of pain, which was your brain's way of saying, hey, Rob, stop doing that. Stop loading these muscles. There's a problem here. And so what that led Harry to do was to sort of ramp up, to start stimulating those muscles and teach the brain to begin to process that differently, to downregulate that perception of threat, which is another way of saying allow you to start using those muscles again. Stop protecting, stop limiting, stop imposing those patterns that are limiting output in that area. It takes time. It's sort of like recalibrating. And if there's actual damage there, it'll take longer. But because what you're doing is really presenting that information and allowing the brain to decide if it is, they sort of test out the water. Does it want to allow a little more? And if it's not safe, it won't. If it is, then it will. So you're accelerating that process of re-educating, recalibrating, relearning function in that area.
Got you. Thank you. That was perfect. Like I said, technical and just a long shot. But yeah, thank you for that. That really does help. Garrett, I reckon it would be a great time to maybe start talking about some specific use cases for the Neubie. Now, there are obviously literally dozens here, but what I'd really sort of like to focus on, I suppose, the neurological or the neurodegenerative side of things, then really Harry's wheelhouse, which the corrective postural pain side of it, and then maybe something of a selfish ask. I'd love to discuss the areas in which Neubie is being used in what's fundamentally my area of academic research, which is in the CFS sort of community, the chronic fatigue, long COVID, etc. To start off with, though, I'd love to jump more into a discussion around how the Neubie can support people neurodegenerative issues, things like MS, multiple sclerosis, etc. I know, of course, you've done some work with Terry Walls. You had a great podcast with her. I think it was a few years ago now, but it was amazing. And for those in the audience who aren't familiar with Dr. Walls, she's a medical doctor. She developed multiple sclerosis. She was wheelchair bound at one point, I believe, and then through the lifestyle and dietary intervention side of things, she was able to greatly reverse a large number of symptoms that she was experiencing. Now, I mean, aside from no, let you ask the question. I'll ask you the question. What do you think is happening in these conditions? Obviously, in multiple sclerosis, there's this demyelination of nerves, or there's this sort of loss of insulation around nerves. How is the Neubie helping with a condition like this, or broadly speaking, these sorts of conditions in general? I doubt it's helping to remyelinate nerves. Is it just again from a case of it helping to modulate that sympathetic tone, find balance, or do you have a feeling as how it's helping people with these sorts of problems?
So there's a few parts to this. I'm glad you mentioned Dr. Walls. For people listening, by the way, it's Terry Walls. It's spelled Wahls.
Yes.
And she's a fabulous practitioner. She has a book called The Walls Protocol, which would be my first recommendation for anyone who gets a diagnosis of MS or any similar autoimmune condition. So, in terms of how we work with MS patients, there's a few parts of this to consider. First, we want to introduce the concept of neuroplasticity, which is the way that we adapt and respond and learn based on the inputs. And so there's a couple ways to conceptualize this. One is to think about neuroplasticity is the window is most open, or the process is most active in childhood. And so children who grow up in the UK or the US are going to hear primarily the English language spoken, perhaps with a slightly different accent. I know you think I have an accent, but
you should try the northeast of England. It's horrendous. I don't think people actually speak English here. It's just like Geordie, and what the hell is that? I don't know.
Try being from South London and living in the northeast. That's even different.
Try being from South Africa and living in the northeast.
Yeah, you trumped me on that one.
So children who grow up in these regions tend to develop that accent, right? They hear the people around them and they sort of adapt to that. Whereas a child who grows up in South America hearing Spanish or Portuguese, or a child who grows up in China hearing Mandarin, they're gonna adapt to that environment, to the sound, the stimulus that they're receiving, and they're gonna hear and understand the intonations and be able to learn to speak those types of sounds and styles, etc. So neuroplasticity is basically how we adapt, how we learn. If we're reading a textbook in school, neuroplasticity is how the structure of our brain changes to consolidate those memories. And depending on how interested we are and how focused we are when we're reading it, we'll have a much greater or lesser response to learn it, or how motivated we are by grades or whatever it might be, right? So neuroplasticity is important here. And it's also interesting to understand with something like for any of us, regardless of, even in the absence of something like MS, there's this use it or lose it phenomenon that is very important to understand. Our bodies want to conserve energy because there might be a famine tomorrow, right? We evolved over tens or hundreds of thousands of years where early humans had issues getting adequate food supply, right? They didn't live in an era of abundance like we have today, at least in most of the world. Not all, but our sort of wiring is to want to conserve energy. And so, it takes a lot of energy to build and maintain new muscle. It takes a lot of energy to build and maintain new nerve pathways to activate those sodium and potassium channels and send electrical signals. Takes quite a bit of energy. And so with MS, especially, this becomes more pronounced. And there's also a dark side of neuroplasticity where when one has a neurodegenerative condition, it starts to become more difficult to move the limbs, to ambulate, to do certain activities. And because it becomes more difficult, they often can fall into the trap of being less and less active. And that accelerates the downward spiral, the dark side of neuroplasticity, called learned disuse, where sometimes the nervous system adapts to just down-regulating certain pathways. And so for patients who have MS and related conditions, it's important to do some amount of physiotherapy just to maintain wherever they are, let alone try to build back and regain function that's been lost. So it's important to get some input, some stimulus, just to maintain that and prevent the further decline. So further downward spiral. So there's the context there, that we just have to take very seriously. And so a big part of the idea with neuroplasticity is that we need stimulus and input in order to drive adaptation, change, any sort of learning, etc. And that stimulus generally is, we're talking about the neuromuscular system, musculoskeletal system. That stimulus is movement. And what we can do with technology like the Neubie is create a lot more input, so that if they're doing one movement of a corrective exercise, it could be the equivalent input of doing 5 or 10 repetitions in the time they're doing one. So you can amplify the effects and get more stimulus and more input to drive neuroplastic change faster and more significantly than you would with just traditional exercise approaches. And that that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is that you have to create enough input so that there's a reason for the body to make a change, to make these longer term neuroplastic adaptations. But then you also have to have enough nutrition and sleep and handling stress and modulating inflammation appropriately. So there's enough resources, because the body, first and foremost, needs resources just to survive, to live through the day. And then there has to be some sort of surplus of energy and resources to rebuild and repair and restore function that has been lost, to tap into the power of neuroplasticity and cause healing and regeneration, or support healing and regeneration. So there's two parts to it. There's the stimulus that you do, in the physio clinic or in Harry's gym, and then there's the sleep and the nutrition and all the things that have to go into it there. So, and both are, you can't have one without the other. So they're both important. But that's where the NeuFit piece comes in, is providing that stimulus and input to accelerate, to I'll say maximize the opportunity for neuroplasticity from a stimulus perspective, make it easier to reach that threshold to drive neuroplasticity. But then the other stuff has to happen outside of there. And so, outside of the gym or the physio clinic. And then the master reset, things like that can certainly help as well, because of the autonomic effects. When we're talking about something where there's an autoimmune condition, there's sort of a runaway
inflammatory response.
Runaway response in the immune system. And so that there's a direct negative feedback loop between the vagus nerve and the immune system, the thymus and the spleen, and the parasympathetic system can help calm down that runaway excess inflammation, immune activity as well.
Yeah, drop those levels of catecholamines, corticosteroid, not corticosteroids, cortisol, etc. Definitely. Do you, I mean, just to speculate, glucocorticoids, not corticosteroids, sorry, my mistake, late in the day. Just to speculate again, do you think there's any chance that there's sort of any neurogenesis happening there? I mean, it sort of jumps on from what we'll talk about earlier, but would you speculate that anything is happening there from this perspective of the Neubie, or is that a bit of a long shot?
Based on what we saw in the neuropathy study that we talked about a while ago, based on that, I think there's reason to believe that there can be some axon growth. There could be collateral sprouting. In this, as you mentioned, MS is more of a demyelinating condition. And based on what we saw there, we saw some remyelination happening in the neuropathy patients who were studied in that study. So we have every reason to believe that can happen here, and there is evidence for remyelination. And it's so the fact that it would happen here, is supported by research. It's it's the pathway is established. It's been established that remyelination can happen given certain circumstances, and this is those being the things that we talked about, right? You need to have enough stimulation, enough recovery, and time in the parasympathetic nervous system, and resources, and all that stuff. Yeah, so have every reason to believe that there is some degree of that happening. Certainly more work to be done, but yeah, it seems like especially the patients we've seen who have just made transformational recoveries over time, of course, but really gotten out of wheelchairs and regained their autonomy when they've been dealing with MS and had become wheelchair bound, had to give up their driver's license, had to rely on a caregiver. We've seen some amazing transformations. So it seems like there's some functional and some structural changes happening there that could explain what's going on. I can't say the ratio of each, but there's definitely some positive changes happening over time.
Yeah, definitely. Fair enough. Okay, next I'd love to discuss how the Neubie can be used in a supportive context when it comes to injury recovery, postural dysfunction, pain management, etc. Now, I am so outside of my wheelhouse now, it's funny. So I'm going to hand this one over to Harry, because this is his jam. So yeah, over to you, mate. Garrett, all yours.
Awesome. Yes, very excited to ask you a few questions, Garrett. Probably too many for the podcast, but yeah, on a day-to-day basis, I am treating people with different types of pain, injury, and going back to what we spoke earlier, it's not always visible. So, why, for instance, the treatment of the mapping process might be really important is because sometimes you can visually see somebody walking and they're laterally, shifting very heavily onto their right side, for instance, and that's causing their torso to shift left, and they've got all sorts of compression issues and head tilts just to compensate, and their feet are doing, stuff that's crazy. But as I say, sometimes it's not always visible, and the mapping process allows now me to see what actually has a deficiency and what is weak and what cannot kind of handle the load. So I guess there's many questions, and Rob, you'll feel free to help me out here. But from a Rob standpoint, for instance, we have a lateral hip shift to the right, and it's tough for him to get over to the left side. And I guess now for me now is using the Neubie in a way that will allow him to kind of load up his left side, teach his body to be able to shift into the left side, whilst of course being able to rebuild his whole system with lots of different approaches with the Neubie. And of course the Neubie is also very, very new to me, so I haven't yet had the experience of using it with lots of hypertrophy work, but from a mechanical side of thing, or as a coach that deals with the mechanical side of things, I guess would I look to use the Neubie as a first port of call, or would you look to exhaust kind of corrective exercises, positional exercises, then start to use the Neubie as a way to increase load without, of course, giving the body too much stimulus? I guess what I'm trying to say is, of course it would differentiate between person to person, but would I look to use the Neubie right away, or would I look to use it deeper down the line to see how much I can get out of somebody without the device?
That's a good question. I like using it as early as possible in the process, and I'll share why that is. It's because you can identify I would sort of call it the first domino, the limitations that would be, or the impediments that would be slowing down progress. So, my understanding of your work, Harry, is that you have a very sophisticated understanding of biomechanics and corrective exercise and precision of muscle activation and precision of movements that you use to activate certain muscles. And if you have someone who has a weak glute med, for example, you could tell them to do some hip hikes, and you can have them do side bridges, and you can have them do various movements to try to get that to activate. And it might take a long time until they are able to actually activate that enough to incorporate it into gait, so the pelvis doesn't sink on the opposite side, or whatever it might be. Just trying to use one example there, but the same framework is going to apply across the board. So it could take a long time. Whereas if you use the Neubie, you can accelerate that. So it's not going to feel like you're pushing that boulder uphill and it just keeps rolling back down on you, or it's not going to feel like as much of an uphill battle, because if you go around and find hotspots, you could figure out, maybe they're not, maybe the person you're working with is not engaging, right? Maybe they're inhibiting a certain muscle because something else. Maybe they're not activating their glute because there's actually an issue in their adductor, And because of that, their nervous system is trying to inhibit them from fully extending their hip because it's afraid that the adductor might strain or tear, or there's some vulnerability in the hip. And so if you go find that, and then you're able to to work on that, all of a sudden they're going to achieve hip extension in 1 or 2 sessions, whereas that might have taken weeks and been just such a grind, and you might make very little progress and wonder why. So it can sort of clean up or get rid of those impediments that would otherwise really be slowing down the process, I think. So I would say you do the same assessment, that you're already doing, looking at where there's inefficient or inappropriate biomechanical strategies, and then you can use the same corrective strategies, but just layer in some mapping in between. Find hotspots, put the pads on the hotspots, and then you'll get a lot more bang for the buck, a lot more impact out of those corrective sessions. I think that's sort of the framework I would use. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. I guess I like to take people from floor-based exercises and integrate them back up to upright body positions. And I know I've mentioned a bit about this to you before, about how you may or may not use eventually with somebody a lot of the multi-dimensional rotational movements, and using the Neubie device with that to allow somebody to connect their external oblique with their opposite glute med. And do you find, or are you going to be using that more and more, do you think, or do you feel like the results are good enough just using more isolated approaches?
I think it depends on the the individual, the client or the patient, and their goals. And I think everything's kind of a progression or a continuum here. So for many people, much of the time, I would recommend starting out with just simple movements with the Neubie on to work through the various compensatory, protective, inhibitory, guarding types of patterns that people have, to just sort of get back to that baseline homeostasis level. And then especially if you're working with a rotational athlete, if you're working with a golfer, or we have a lot of baseball players over here, but I mean, of course there's rotation. You guys have a lot of rugby and soccer or football. You're European football, your version of football.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of there's a rotational component. I think that's one of the things that is misunderstood, how much rotation there is in some. People think of running as just flexion, extension, straight line, but as there's so much rotation in that. So if you're trying to get someone back there, then I think working in those movements that you're describing is important. And my goal is not to tell you what movements to do, but it's to tell you how to use the Neubie to amplify the benefit of what you're doing. If you really like kettlebells, well, let's talk about how we can use the Neubie to amplify the effects of kettlebells. If you really want to work on, rotational precision biomechanics and sequencing of the pelvis and thoracic spine and arms, let's figure out how we can make that better.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's quite a lot of controversy right now, and it's quite kind of evident sometimes over social media platforms, in terms of as humans, mechanically, we are rotational. We evolved to, by being upright and being able to, sprint away from, lions and throw spears and things like that. And there's a lot of, I guess, practitioners out there that would not ever advise to do, say, deadlifts and work in that sagittal plane, and almost bad mouth, doing movements such like compound lifts, and they would say you should only be, in terms of you should only rotate. And I thought, what's your thoughts on that? Because I'm very much in the middle. I am from rugby. I used to do a lot of back squatting, and you see people sometimes now saying, "Gosh, that's compressing your spine. You should never do that. That's going to cause this, and this." Work your legs in this way, which then transfers more into walking, running, and for me, I'm not on either side. I feel like we can benefit from using both approaches, of course, person dependent. I guess the ultimate goal would be to get somebody back to doing more of those rotational movements, depending on what they want to do, of course. But of course, if you're working with an athlete that is a shot putter, for instance, or is just a deadlifter or just a power lifter, then I guess it differs. But I didn't know what your thoughts on that would be, because it's sometimes hard as a coach to just be there and sit on the kind of fence and just see people saying stuff about certain movements. But I don't believe there's a wrong or a right movement. I think posture is such a big thing. We don't just need one posture, we need hundreds, and we need to be able to access that at any time sometimes. And I think we just need to condition the body to be able to do X, Y, and Z with kind of freedom in a sense. But yeah, it's quite sometimes tricky as a coach to see other people's values and ideas, and sometimes you think, well, that's just causing a little bit of beef, and maybe it's just to get some social media exposure. I don't know, but they seem pretty passionate in terms of this is something you should never do. You shouldn't squat. You shouldn't deadlift. But as I say, we need to squat. We need to stand up from our seat. We're not going to rotate as we do that. So, but yeah, that's sometimes where I kind of look from, and I'm like, wow, that's quite a thing to say.
That's an interesting topic, and I don't know that there is any single exercise that I would say everyone should always do, or no one should ever do, or everyone should always avoid. I don't know that there's anything where I would make such a strong blanket statement like that. I think the closest I would come is what you're alluding to there. The closest I would come to a blanket statement is that we all, if we want to be generally active, right? Assuming we're not talking about someone who's a quadriplegic or multiple limb amputee, or ignoring for a moment those types of circumstances. If we want to be normally active, we generally need to be able to have an efficient gait pattern, right? It's important that we walk and do anything that we need to do to fill in the gaps that would be inhibiting us from being able to have an efficient gait pattern. Because there's rotation, of course, sagittal, frontal, and rotational plane movements just in the walking gait. I know many of us, myself included to some degree, have lost the ability to squat. We all should have that ability to squat, but so I think there are, in terms of like the closest I would get to a blanket statement is, we probably should spend some time in that squatting position. I also think that we spend a lot less time with, we spend so much time with the arms just in front of us, driving, eating, using at the computer, getting the shoulders out, above us, spending some time hanging. I think we evolved, certainly from monkeys, hanging a lot, but then, reaching up, reaching for things. I think those types of things, I think virtually everybody can benefit from adding in some, making sure they're doing some, gait, some walking, some squatting, some hanging over from an overhead bar or tree limb or something like that. Some of those things. And then from there, I would just say it's more specific to what that person's issues are and what everyone needs to work on.
100%. I know, it comes down to the whole fascia system as well, and people saying you cannot just work on the fascial system. Of course, again, it's a tough one to maybe say at the moment. I think more studies need to be done, but in terms of that whole, if you deadlift and you move just completely blocky all the time, is the fascia going to be more dehydrated? And comparing to rotational movements, and I know that you have the glove technique, which I'm really excited to use. Have you found that the kind of method with the electric glove? Have you seen or done any studies where you can see more of that gel-like water, that kind of negatively charged water, move more around through the fascial system after using the Neubie?
So there's one point there before talking about the glove. I do think it's important in talking about fascia and connective tissue to understand. It's like the nervous system. Use it or lose it in terms of the range of motion. The fascia, the connective tissue is going to adapt to the ranges in which it's used. So if I don't, for example, lift my arms up overhead, eventually that window is going to shorten. And even if I, can relax the muscles to allow me to get there, if the joint capsule has shortened over time, that's going to have to remodel, or it may never be able to, you might be limited. So taking your connective tissue, loading it through all of its available ranges is very important, because use it or lose it applies there too. So if you talk about connective tissue, becoming more fibrous or dehydrated, or literally shrinking over time, because again, it doesn't, the body doesn't want to spend the energy to maintain extra tissue and ranges and resources that it's not using. So, so I do think that it's like, there's a great quote that's something to the effect of, the body that you have, whether it's body composition, muscle and fat, or whether it's ability and range of motion, the body you have is the body that you've earned. It's based on what you've done up to this point in your life,
Exactly. Yeah.
And so
the accumulation, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, they say hindsight is the only truth, something to that extent.
Yeah, definitely. I'm interested to know. Sorry, Garrett.
That's a good one. Hindsight is the only truth. Yeah, I mean, so in terms of the question about hydrating tissue and stuff like that, what we're doing with the electric glove is essentially going to be, just maybe an accelerated form of what you see in manual therapy. And so to the degree that you're able to increase the hydration and quality and structure of tissues with manual therapy, you'll see the same with the glove. Our goal would be just to have it happen with some less effort and pressure on the part of the practitioner, and shorter duration and time, but it's going to be a similar endpoint there.
Yeah. And I assume just in the glove, sorry to interrupt, just with the glove, the less you're sort of forcing and manipulating tissue. I mean, the moment you sort of start to interfere with tissue that's already potentially in a spasm, that's going to sort of drive up that sympathetic response again, I'd imagine. So by utilizing something that is achieving the same output in terms of mechanical release, but without putting that same amount of physical stress on the body, you're going to, by way of that, reduce that sympathetic load on the body as a whole as well, as sort of subsequently improving tissue mobility, I'd imagine, just speculating there with that sort of flow.
Yeah, definitely.
I think, there's a few pieces there. I mean, I generally like what you're saying there, where you can get more bang for the buck with less stress and effort. And there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? You're not just getting something for nothing. But if you're more strategic, for the same investment of time and effort, you can get a lot more of a result, I'll say.
Fair. No, that makes total sense. Garrett, I know we're starting to run up on time. So I reckon we'll finish off with this sort of this next question, and then let you get on your way, as I'm sure you've got better things to do than just keep the pair of us occupied for the rest of the day. Perfect. Anyway, so we've obviously covered that the Neubie is great in neurodegenerative conditions. It's an amazing tool for physical rehab. Now, maybe it's a sort of a newer development, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I've noticed that a few practitioners are starting to use it more in the sort of the CFS, the long COVID community, as I mentioned earlier. So conditions where there is a high sort of a viral component, a high viral element, or bacterial, or whatever it is. It could be some sort of chronic Lyme, whether or not you believe in chronic Lyme, that's a discussion for another day. Now, my working theory here is that fundamentally that by improving the sort of the parasympathetic tone of the nervous system, getting the body into a more rest and digest state, it's lowering the levels of these stress hormones that we talked about earlier, these corticosteroid glucocorticoids, I'll get that right eventually, and your catecholamines, etc. And this in turn is essentially modulating the immune system. We'll leave all the transcription factors and cytokines alone, but by lowering this high level stress on the body, you're lowering the inflammatory burden on the cell, which is then fundamentally improving mitochondrial function by way of, I suppose, balancing the redox state within the mitochondria, and limiting the loss of electrons of complex 4 and 5, which for the audience is where ATP or cellular energy is fundamentally created. Now, as I'm sure you know, when you have that sort of that electron leakage, that extracellular ATP that spills out of the mitochondria, it can cause a lot of mitochondrial dysfunction, sort of colloquially seen as what's called the cell danger response, which I'm sure you're also familiar with as well. Now, that's my working theory, is that fundamentally how the Neubie is helping in these sorts of conditions is it's helping to modulate this stress response, which then has this trickle-down effect, ultimately positively affecting cell energetics. Am I on track there, or did I just waste 3 minutes of your life?
I think that's exactly right. You said, I think a more detailed and sophisticated version of what I would have said in answering the question, which is I think the greatest impact on the long COVID community is that ability to create with the master reset, or perhaps even other techniques, create more of a shift into the parasympathetic nervous system. As you said, it has that negative feedback on excessive immune, kind of runaway autoimmune or excess inflammation. And then the other piece I would add is, you mentioned chronic fatigue. We know there's a lot of benefits of exercise, but there's also this conundrum that if you're someone who has chronic fatigue, it's like, well, shoot, how I can barely get off the couch. How the hell am I supposed to exercise? So if you can use technology like the Neubie to start to titrate up, start to get a little bit of exercise, while you're just sitting or standing there, you can start to build up very methodically, very safely, very slowly, build up the level of input and stress and challenge you can take that your body can handle, and start to get some of those adaptations, those exercise induced positive adaptations. You can start to get those and sort of build up over time, without eliciting that stress response, or without eliciting the cell danger response from over exercising, going out and doing too much. So I think that's sort of the other piece I would add. But yeah, definitely the autonomic nervous system, and then being able to kind of safely increase, start with a minute at a certain level, and then titrate up the power and the duration just very methodically, because you can control all the variables very objectively.
It's very similar to just in terms of just training with external load. Very similar in terms of you want to progress linearly as and when it's safe to do so, but instead of using kilos, or in probably over there it's pounds, but of course you can just turn up the Neubie just another notch, and with an instance you're getting that same load effect, but slightly differently to weights, which of course in terms of loading the weight or body with external load, there's no real technique needed. Like, you can mimic the same amount of stimulus and load without having to really get into certain positions that might cause that person to feel vulnerable or fear that kind of position from experience.
Yeah, well said. You can start to, the problem is going too far, which sometimes you don't necessarily know you've gone too far until you've done it, and then having a setback for days with a chronic fatigue patient. So being able to just really do it objectively, slowly, I think has been valuable in those cases.
Perfect. Yeah. Garrett, you've been a star, as have you, Harry. Like I said, I'm sure Harry wants his dinner, and that you, Garrett, have got a day to get on with. So just to close up, Garrett, what beyond where people can find you, of course, what is next for Neubie? Do you have any sort of anything in the pipeline that you can share with us that's maybe not top secret, or what's next for you in the company? And then again, where can people find you?
So, in terms of what's on tap for us, certainly more research. I mentioned that neuropathy study. We have several other published studies. We have some exciting ones, including one with the Mayo Clinic, which is a big organization here in the U.S.
Yeah.
We've got some really exciting things going on study-wise. And then, I believe we're the leaders in direct current, the gold standard in this category. And so, we're always wanting to be innovative. So I'm looking at different ways to incorporate AI and learnings into this. So, different things technology-wise that I intend to be able to, bring to market in the years ahead. So we're definitely working on all that stuff. And in terms of where to find us, please DM with me and our team, interact with us on social media. We're most active on Instagram, NeuFit RFP for rehab, fitness, and performance. And that's NeuFit is NEU, like neurological. And then I have a personal page that I just started in the last year or so. I had been using the business one, but it's my first and last name, Garrett.Salpeter. And our website is, you can just go to neufit.com and that'll direct you to our actual URL is www.new.fit. And then we do have a UK distributor who Harry has interacted with, and their company, they sell a few products, including the Neubie. The company is called RPX, so it's rp-x.com if for your fellow countrymen or countrywomen there in the UK.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. You're just doing such amazing work. I'll be sending my CV in. Harry, where can people find you, mate?
Sorry about my crazy little dog barking there. She wants to make an appearance, clearly. So I'm on Instagram heavily as well. So it's TAGFIT. So that's TagFit. And then you can also find my website, which is tagfit.co.uk.
Perfect. Gentlemen, thank you both so much for your time. It was a great conversation, and I hope we can do it again soon.
Thank you so much, Rob.
Thank you.